Welcome to Climate Change and Health in Small Island Developing States, focused on the Caribbean. If you require translation into Spanish or French, please use the link posted in the chat and choose your desired language at the bottom of the Zoom screen. You should continue to keep this browser open as well to utilize the chat and Q&A features. Please be sure to scroll down and hit mute on the video. Please use the Q&A feature to submit any questions for the panelists. This session is being recorded. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's conference session number 2, Greening of Cities for Better Climate and Better Health. My name is Nadine Wedderburn, and I will be the moderator for this session. This session will focus on innovative approaches to the greening of cities, a strategy that has been promoted by various planning and development agencies around the world as a sustainable way to reach better climate and public health goals. Over the next 30 minutes, we will learn of the roles of transportation and the redesigning of cities in reducing greenhouse gas emissions and building sustainable cities with specific attention on the Caribbean. There are 3 panelists in this session who will each present for 10 minutes. The last 15 minutes of the session have been reserved for the audience to engage with the presenters through question and answer. Now it is indeed my pleasure to introduce the presenters in speaking order. First, we will hear from James Patterson Waterston. Mr. James Patterson Waterston is currently a doctoral candidate at University College London and Director of Vivid Economics, a subsidiary of McKinsey & Company. In his role, Mr. Patterson Waterston leads Vivid Economics' work on net zero cities and the urban decarbonization transition, with particular focus on assessing well-being and other social outcomes of such interventions. He holds an MPhil in Environmental Planning from the University of Cambridge and an MSc in Construction and Development Economics from University College London. Mr. Patterson Waterston has successfully led important projects for clients including the IFC, World Bank, and IDB. Our second presenter is Professor Michelle Maikou, Professor of Urban and Regional Planning in the Department of Geomatics Engineering and Land Management at the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine. Professor Maikou has conducted extensive research and training on water management, climate change, disaster risk reduction, and urban planning, and currently serves as a coordinating lead author of the Small Islands chapter of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change 6th Assessment Report, Working Group 2. Professor Maikou holds a PhD in Urban Planning from McGill University, an MSc in Urban Planning from the University of Hong Kong, and a Bachelor of Arts in Geography and Social Sciences from the University of the West Indies. After Professor Maikou, we will hear from Ms. Renelle Sargent. Ms. Sargent is an urban planner and designer from Trinidad and Tobago, with experience in urban policy, public space research, community planning, and the digitalization of construction permitting. Ms. Sargent is the founder of Public Space Global, an urban design advocacy group, and is a Caribbean region liaison for the Epidemic Urbanism Initiative. She completed her graduate studies at the University of Sheffield, UK, and later continued her studies as a Chevening Scholar in Interdisciplinary Urban Design at the University College of London. We thank them all for sharing some of their research with us today and look forward to the time of Q&A after all 3 presentations have ended. So, without further ado, it is indeed my pleasure to turn over the mic to you, Mr. Patterson Waterston. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Nadine. I'm just sharing my slides. So I'm very pleased to be presenting to everybody on the line today. I'm going to be talking a little bit about the big picture, the role that cities can play in the low carbon transition and what that means for the people that live in cities. That cities are special. Cities are the places where most people around the world live, a trend that's continuing. It's also where most economic activity happens around the world. And because they are part of the problem, they're also a really central part of the solution, a really central role that they'll play in the low carbon climate transition. Now, our research for various partners, including the Coalition for Urban Transitions, has shown that actually it's possible to cut up to 90% of emissions from cities using technologies that currently exist, which means you've got to beg the question, why is it not currently happening at the scale and at the speed which is required to deliver the resilient places in which we all want to live? There's a very significant benefit actually to the investment in those cities. Our work has shown that the investment required be $1.8 trillion per year through to 2030. We're talking about a very significant investment that's required for that transition. Now, that transition will also have direct benefits on people that live in cities. And that's something I want to talk a little bit about today, the challenges and also the solutions. Our work has shown that actually, as part of that transition and the decarbonisation agenda, we can achieve better health outcomes and also greater economic opportunities for vulnerable and minority groups within cities. I think that's a really important part of the public service agenda when we're looking at the role cities play. I think there are two challenges to the greening of cities and the implications for sustainable cities, particularly in the Caribbean, but these are global issues. In my own work, I've worked for various Caribbean states, and these are very much the case, particularly on NDCs that we've worked on. The first one is that climate planning and climate policy is usually focused at the national level. And I think that there are, many of you on the line will be aware that there are sometimes challenges when we try and integrate public service needs and delivery, which is often at the city level or the local authority level, when we have national level ambitions. And I think that we need to find ways to try and consolidate the different levers and incentives at the national level with the delivery level, which is often in the form of city planning interventions. There is currently a significant gap. The second one is that climate policy as it stands often doesn't consider the externalities related to social impacts such as health, well-being, and increasingly equity issues. And that's partly because these are issues quite often led by city authorities and local governments. They're closest to the ground when it comes to dealing with these issues. National governments are often further away, and actually I think that's part of the challenge. So when we're looking at successful ways to green cities, we need to think about how we can develop a cohesive way to integrate ambitions to green our cities with the positive social externalities that are possible. So what are the solutions if they're the challenges? I think a key one, and this is building on work that we've done for people like C40 and the Coalition, is to ensure that the role of cities is captured in national level sustainable development policies. This is something that currently doesn't happen. Cities are often excluded from the national levers, from the national incentives related to rollout of EVs, for example, or the decarbonisation of the energy grid. And actually, it's really important that they're part of the debate, they're included in these mechanisms. And as we have COP26 in now only a matter of weeks, I think we'll all be aware that it's national governments that are presenting delegates. It's not often the largest cities in the world or the urban areas, which quite probably will have the single largest ability to change the lives of their own citizens. So because cities depend on the decisions of government, they need to be better at making the case about why they're important and why they are a vehicle for the decarbonisation agenda. At the moment, only about, just shy of 40% of countries in their NDCs have specific strategies for urban areas. And this is a significant gap. And in our research, we think that national and state level governments have primary authority over up to 35% of the potential decarbonisation potential in cities. So this is a really important area that we need to address. In terms of the second solution, there is a paucity of evidence. Many of the people working in this space, and many of the cities involved, need strong evidence bases in order to inform investments in decision making. Almost everything we're talking about, whether it's a planning intervention whether it's an infrastructure investment in cities, it requires money. And money is only released when there is very clear evidence-based. And I think there's a particular gap when we're trying to link outcomes, particularly those related to things like well-being, the health impacts in cities, and the input, the actual investment. So we need to build up and improve the evidence base. And over much of my career, particularly in the last 5 years while I've been at Vivid, we've been trying to develop that evidence base to improve the quality of the evidence, to help governments and cities improve their decision making and deliver the greener cities that we all wish. On the right hand side of this slide, you'll see some of the more recent examples. Greenkeeper is a tool which I'll go through in a bit more detail in a moment, which enables us to set an actual value, an economic value to urban green space. And this obviously helps the case for understanding why it's there as an asset, but also makes the case for new urban green space. The second project is a piece of work that hopefully will be published quite soon for the Inter-American Development Bank, looking at how we can use public space to reactivate spaces reactivate cities post-COVID. The third example is a project launched last week in a flagship report for C40, looking at the impacts with a particular focus on health and well-being outcomes in terms of premature deaths of the phase out of coal power plants within 500 kilometres of cities around the world. And finally, we've done a lot of work for organisations such as the Royal Town Planning Institute, actually trying to develop the evidence base for good planning and looking at what the role planning can play in reducing carbon intensity of urban areas. And the way we do this ultimately is about identifying those impact channels, whether it's well-being, whether it's health impacts, whether it's the impact on skills or issues such as the just transition, and trying to find ways to quantify that. And we do that through traditional cost benefit analysis, some of our econometric modelling, natural capital accounting, but there's generally not one answer. We consolidate these approaches to build a stronger evidence base to inform policy development and decision making. So just to go through one of those in a bit more detail, this is our Greenkeeper tool. This is something we developed in conjunction with the UK government. This is an online tool that enables us to, at a very granular level, understand the financial and economic value associated with green space. And this is to help make the case for literal greening of cities, because without this evidence base, in many cases, governments with limited budgets can't make that case. And we want them to be able to understand the interconnections between different budget lines. And you'll see here from our work in London that actually there are very significant well-being and physical health benefits associated with the rollout of green space in London. And our third solution is around developing place-based interventions, which are intersectional. Too often we focus and discuss the issues of green cities and don't recognise that actually there are real big opportunities to build the evidence base around skills development, around the opportunities associated with greening cities, and actually we need to build on that. And we've worked recently with various cities, including Rome, on how we can assess the positive impacts of green space, of green city planning in Rome, with a focus on the labour market. In that case, we discovered that politicians actually, the reason they're going to embrace greenness is actually because of the employment opportunities. So our role there was to try and build out with C40 the different levers that you can pull in order to ensure that it is a just transition in that city, to ensure that the opportunities are accessible to all. And actually that can help make the political argument for the greening of our cities. So in summary, I just wanted to essentially say it's all about evidence. It's about improving our ability to quantify impacts, and that will ultimately inform decision making so that we can develop decarbonised cities in which we all want to live, work and play. Thank you.
Thank you, James. And so we'll move to our next presenter, Professor Michael.
Thank you. I just want to make sure that you are seeing my screen. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Excellent. Okay, thank you. It's a pleasure to join you this afternoon from Trinidad, and I appreciate the opportunity to share with you my knowledge of Caribbean cities and what attempts are being made to address climate change, and in terms of how we can meet the health and well-being needs of our citizens. Right, so the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change, Working Group 1, has actually made a number of observations about the types of common changes they're seeing in small islands. And one of the, amongst those that they have found, they include that there will be observed warming. They've observed the warming in small islands, and we anticipate that there will be an increase in heat extremes and heat stress. We also found that the sea level will very likely continue to rise, and that is more so in the context of an increase in the greenhouse gas emissions. In addition, sea level rise will, coupled with storm surges and wave energy, will exacerbate coastal inundation. And we can also see some coastal erosion along the coastal areas. And one of the key common changes is that we will see more intense hurricane activity in our region. And we have certainly witnessed categories 4 and 5 hurricanes in our region in recent times. And that's especially so if we are unable to cap the increase in temperature beyond the 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. So we asked some of the key questions. What are some of the climate change impacts on our Caribbean cities, and on what are the health ramifications? So we do note that there is rising temperature, and we will see higher levels of heat stress, mortality, and reduced labor productivity. With sea level rise, which is a slow onset climate change, we can see flooding in coastal areas, economic loss, the loss of income, and with that, there will be mental health issues that can arise. With flooding, especially given the intensity of rainfall we are seeing in our wet season, we see psychological trauma, the increase in vector-borne diseases, and we can also see increased mortality. With coastal erosion, we will see a loss of coastal urban space, and we do know our coastal areas have typically been areas of recreational value to us, and our coastal capital cities have historically been built along our coastlines. So a lot of our infrastructure and economic assets are along the coastline as well. Again, some of the other key climate change issues include drought, water scarcity, saline intrusion of our freshwater aquifers. And what that can do is there will be implications for food security, for nutrition. In the case of water scarcity, there will be implications for public health, sanitation, and hygiene. With the saline intrusion of coastal aquifers, we will have less potable water, which can have implications for health. And of course, the big issue is the increasing, more intense, rather, storms and hurricanes in our region, which can have psychological trauma. We can see diseases following storms and hurricane activity, and of course, mortality. I think pictorially, we can see the damage that has been done by these category 4 and 5 hurricanes. This is a photograph of Roseau in Dominica, where there was a loss of lives, trauma, mental health. They're still in recovery mode. Many waterborne diseases sprung from that category intense hurricane in around 2018, actually. And this has implications for the Caribbean in that 70% of our economic assets also tend to be along the coast, and 60% of our population is concentrated in that area where you can have all that storm activity, storm surge in particular. So in unpacking what are some of the climate adaptation strategies, we do have a mixed bag. There is no simple solution. So what we find as practitioners is we draw on a number of strategies. It could be retreat options where we push back from the coastline. It can be accommodation where we stay put, but we use ecosystem-based adaptation measures to green our cities. And of course, you have protection, which is the hard infrastructure or engineering options. What we have been using, for example, in greening, is the ecosystem-based adaptation options such as mangrove replanting. And we have softer options such as land use planning and the use of early warning systems to protect people and move them away from the coast in the event of an extreme event. So this is actually a picture of the Palisados in Jamaica out of Kingston. And that connector road was actually being impacted by rising sea level and storm surge activity. And so they elevated the roadway, and at the same time they employed the ecosystem-based adaptation measure using the mangrove replanting here. So when we talk about greening of our cities, we talk about blue-green infrastructure, and urban planning has a key role to play. We're talking about designing with nature, and we've always learned this as students of planning, that we need to design with nature, not against nature. In doing so, we need to distill indigenous and local knowledge, which has been around for a long time, and utilize it with science-driven policy. We need, in that case, to have robust climate change research using empirical evidence to provide cogent arguments for investments. We will not succeed in attracting funding to deal with the greening of our cities, whether it's from locally mobilized or domestic funding or international grants. We have to have the empirical evidence, and we have to begin to do the feasibility studies as to what options are feasible. Now, I want to take you back to the fact that the Caribbean has had solutions historically. For example, a lot of our Spanish cities originally had what you call the zocalos, or the squares, which are open areas. And so, for example, Havana, which celebrated 500 years since it's coming into the new world and settlement, has urban parks within the city center. And you can see to the left, a city park where different generations of people have gathered, and there are trees for shading. On the other side, you do see efforts at greening and to reduce the heat stress and to help with the groundwater infiltration and so on. Now, you do know there is some concretized surface area there. And again, that can be modified and made green so that we can have the benefits of not just improved health and well-being, but also flood mitigation, etc. We also need to look at the greening of our parks and waterfronts. Bridgetown is a coastal city, and the Carenage area and the river has been cleaned up, given its new UNESCO World Heritage status. And the cooling effect of that water is very, very important for our Caribbean cities. Our cities are connected to the sea as well. And so we need to capitalize on the use of those rivers and waterfronts. And then on the right, you have the Savannah, which is a huge open space in Port of Spain, Trinidad, which is a living part of our city. It's used for recreational purposes. It's used for the infiltration of water during periods of intense flooding. And it's also an area where you have clean air and a microclimate. We look at the vernacular architecture. This is Havana, but there are many parts of the Caribbean, for example, in Kingstown, in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, in the older parts of the city of Port of Spain, where you've had the verandas, you've had these arcades, where people sit in the shaded area. And that's what you call climate sensitive architecture. And it has existed in our part of the world for a very, very long time. In terms of beating heat stress, we've seen the traditional architecture where you have the hip roofs so that the warm air rises, you have the jalousie windows to keep the areas cool and shaded. You've had the verandas, you've had porticos, and you've had those gable windows that emit or release the hot air. In coping with flooding, traditionally in flood-prone areas of Trinidad and parts of Guyana, we have been building off the ground, elevating and building on stilts so as to prevent flooding of the houses and the damage that comes in terms of economic damage, the trauma of always recovering after flood events, and all the economic assets lost from and household savings. So again, we've been doing this before. It's indigenous knowledge. There are new ways of doing things, of course, and you can look at the underground infrastructure corridors, which double as green spaces in urban areas. And this is useful when we have hurricane activity. So to promote blue-green infrastructure, we need to integrate our policies and plans, whether they're spatial plans, sectoral plans. We need to work with public-private partnerships. We need finance. We need to have a multidisciplinary approach, utilizing urban planners, architects, engineers, landscape architects as well. And we need to have stakeholder engagement to prioritize how we can go about greening our cities. In planning, we can look at what you call compact urban form, where we have an improved density. We can have not low density development, but we can have medium density, protect our forests, rainforests and watersheds, improve groundwater infiltration, and ensure that we have less sprawl to protect our urban areas from loss of agricultural land. So we also need to look at cleaner energy, which will give us less pollution, make our cities walkable, and we have more dedicated bicycle lanes, which will improve health and well-being.
We have about 1 minute left. If you could wrap up for us, Professor Maiku, I'm sorry.
In closing, I want to say that we need to improve our technical capacity for implementing innovative solutions, looking at solar and wind energy, rooftop gardens. And in looking at a new narrative, we just simply need to look at transformative urban adaptation, multidisciplinary inputs, stakeholder engagement, public education for behavioral change. And we need to explore options for climate finance and closing research gaps, which are obviously a top priority. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Maiku. And so next we have Ms. Renelle Sargent. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm really happy to join the panel this afternoon to talk about some of the options for greening the public realm in the Caribbean, specifically to help us adapt to climate change, but also to address issues of health. Next, please. I'm going to talk about, examine and assess the state of the public realm in the Caribbean, some of the options available for introducing that green infrastructure as urban assets, as well as some of the pathways required to achieve this. Next, please. When we assess many of our urban centers in the Caribbean, there's rarely a sense of dereliction, a sense of disjointedness, a sense that it separates people from each other, but it also separates people from nature. And at the same time, it sort of brings us closer to meteorological hazards. Next, please. Now, these issues all call into question how we design and how we manage the public realm, and particularly how and why expenditure within the built environment sector happens. Next, please. I'm going to share a quick definition of the public realm. These are the shared outdoor spaces which are open and accessible to members of the public. It includes several types of spaces, and I'll move on to examine a couple of these. Next, please. It includes spaces such as plazas, playgrounds, bridges, markets, bus stops, and pathways. Now, typically or historically, These were really the spaces that were created by colonial authorities. Today, we have a much broader constellation of people involved in working on and reshaping the built environment. Next, please. So I'm going to have a quick look at some of these. We have central government, we have local government as well in some countries in the Caribbean, and also the private sector and civil society and community organizations. It's really these organizations who may play coordinating, design and construction, and even financing roles at different times and on different projects. And these are the actors that need to make deliberate decisions to implement that urban greening that we would like to see in some of our urban centers. Next, please. I'm going to move on to talk about some of the options or specific strategies that we can use in the Caribbean. Horizontal and vertical green spaces is one of the things we should be looking at, whether that's urban agriculture, green facades, green roofs, etc. We should also be looking at street modifications such as permeable and porous pavements, cycle lanes, and even street trees. On the urban drainage side of things, definitely channel restoration, detention ponds, and swales are all options that we should be looking at. Next, please. Many of those options, they fall under the umbrella of nature-based solutions, and I always like to give definitions, so I'll give some here. Nature-based solutions are really those options which just aim to bring in more nature and more natural processes into the environment, even managing and restoring existing ones. And when we think about that network or those green and blue spaces throughout the urban environment, we're talking about the green infrastructure of the urban system, and specifically the options which aim to help us adapt to climate change. Those are ecosystem-based approaches. Now, those nature-based solutions in conjunction with green mobility or greener forms of mobility is really what we need to contribute to that greening or that green transformation for the public realm. Next, please. I would have already mentioned that ecology of solutions related to greening, but I should also say and also stress that they can have significant positive impacts on both public health and climate adaptation, and through multiple pathways, looking at respiratory health, mental health, cardiovascular health, and physical activity. Even children's immunity can be positively impacted by looking at public realm interventions. We can also look at, on the climate adaptation side of things, water management and cooling, as well as some of the core benefits that we can achieve through urban greening. Next, please. So I'm going to talk about a couple of solutions. I'll start with the simplest and probably the most proven solution, and that's urban trees. They have been shown to decrease the rate of surface runoff, increase groundwater infiltration. They also have multiple positive benefits in terms of mental health, reducing urban air pollution. It's estimated that between 8 and 25% of plants per square foot is what is really needed to achieve those positive air quality impacts. Trees can be used in existing urban spaces, green spaces. They can also be placed along streets and specially designed tree pits, which are really designed to ensure the survival of the plants. Next, please. Trees also, particularly shade trees, can also achieve as much as 2 to 8 degrees of cooling in the urban environment, and particularly when they're implemented alongside other cooling features, such as maybe water features or shaded spots, they can help to ameliorate the urban heat island effects. Please. I want to highlight one example. One country leading on this front in the Caribbean is Jamaica. As of January this year, it has actually achieved 500,000 of its 3 million tree planting goal exercise. Next, please. Another intervention that we can look at in the urban environment or in the public realm is really changing the floorscape of play areas for children. When we introduce soil and plants which mimic natural environments, that has actually been shown to improve children's immunity in as little as 1 month. Next, please. So I will show a couple more examples from the Caribbean. In recent years, we've begun to see public realm designs which have tried to incorporate a mix of green and gray infrastructure. I do want to stress that it's not green above all else. Green and gray can be incorporated and complement each other. Church Village Green and Tapis Rouge in Haiti have both incorporated rainwater harvesting. In Barbados, it's used to irrigate the plants on site, while in Haiti, it's actually stored and transported to nearby households to meet their daily needs. Next, please. Again, I want to move on to talk about green mobility options within the urban environments in the Caribbean. Green mobility really means that we're prioritizing active forms of transport, whether that's walking or cycling, public transport, or low emissions vehicles. But what that really requires is an urban environment with green spaces that people want to go to, that people feel safe in, spaces that are connected perhaps by permeable pavements, and where throughout the urban environment, there's really the infrastructure to support that kind of movement, whether it's cycle pathways in like local residential neighborhoods, or installing electric vehicle charging stations or shaded bus stops. Those interventions in the public realm can really be part of wider transportation system improvements. Next, please. Looking at sustainable urban drainage, there are already a suite of solutions which are available. Some of these have been implemented and even assessed in the Caribbean. There was a 2014 study done in Trinidad and Tobago that tried to do a cost-benefit analysis of some of these interventions, and it really suggested that swales and rainwater harvesting are two areas that should be prioritized because of the high cost-benefit ratios. They also looked at retention ponds and filter strips as high urgency measures because of their potential impact on urban flooding, which we experience a lot of in Trinidad and Tobago. Next, please. Another example I'm going to highlight, Antigua has been doing really well. They've actually used their adaptation fund to implement some of these drainage improvements throughout the McKinnon watershed. Next, please. In the region, we also have the example of St. Lucia, which is one of a handful of countries globally, which has included urban greening in their national adaptation plan. Some of the measures that they've specified include green roofs, urban afforestation, natural buffers, and green spaces. But I should also say it's not just a question of how many or the quantity of these spaces that are provided throughout the urban environment. It's about where specifically these spaces are located and how they're connected, as well as the structural aspects of the vegetation themselves or the other measures and their potential performance. Next, please. So this is all leading me to talk about the research that we need in the Caribbean. It's really about systematizing our evidence base, looking at the climate models that we have available, place-specific spatial data, as well as the performance of green and green measures together, and documenting and reviewing some of the projects that we've already implemented in the urban environment. Next, please. To deliver the greener public realm that we would like to see, it's a challenging task, particularly because urban development is so notoriously siloed. So we really need to look at entry points of existing projects, whether that's at the community level, partnerships between government and community, which we have begun to see in many countries, as well as small SMEs related to nature-based solutions as well. So I'll wrap up and end by saying that the greening strategies that I've outlined and many others will really require changing the mindset of treating the public realm as an afterthought. Green solutions should really just be recognized for their multiple benefits, their multiple functionalities, and should be treated as a core value when we're working on the site-specific or the micro scale in the urban environment. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all. We've certainly gotten a full picture of what is contained in studying and implementing strategies for better health and better climate insofar as greening our cities across the Caribbean is concerned. I know I took away some main points I heard: integration time and time again, and this real emphasis on systematizing policy making, infrastructure design, and planning to develop this research and implementation agenda that we're all after with this conference. So there are a few questions in the chat box. I want to start with the first one that came in, and I'm going to direct this to Mr. Patterson Waterston. There are health co-benefit tools that have been used outside the Caribbean to estimate the benefits from green space, active transportation, improvements in air quality, and so on. What are some barriers or enablers for using these tools in the Caribbean?
It's a really good question. Thank you for it. I think there's two. One is actually awareness of the tools. When I work with cities and governments, I think there's often a significant under-awareness of these tools. And it's not always about having a consultant in place or an expert. Many of these things, including things produced by C40 Cities, Orval in the UK, which is available to users globally, are available and accessible. But I think we have to recognise that quite often decision makers and officers within local authorities that often are in a position of power to utilise these either do not have the capacity because they're time restrained or the budgets to investigate these things. We know that quite often people are not thinking about these things in a strategic way. And I think both Michelle and Ronelle in their very good presentations outlined the fact that we know a lot about this, and it's the implementation that's the challenge because of the siloed nature of urban interventions. And we need to think about these things in a holistic way, but that does require time and resources. And I think that's where everybody that works in the urban realm, I think is not very good at that. We're not very good at working together and recognizing that medical professionals, public health systems, our transport and mobility providers need to work with urban planners and urban governments to use this evidence base. I don't think it's about, we have enough evidence. It's about people working together and understanding the co-benefits and working together. And that's where I think the challenge is, less about actually building the evidence base.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much. So I'm going to ask the next question that I think is a good follow-on from James's answer. And this one I'm going to direct to you, Ronelle. How can we reduce the propensity of modern property developers to fill every part of a new development with houses and buildings, and with little or no public space for kids to play, for older folks to have a safe space to connect? Do developments have to be completely bulldozed in order to build homes?
Thanks for that question. It's an important one. I'm going to talk maybe based on my experience as an officer working in a local planning office. What typically happens is that you get an application that you need to assess, but you have a set of rules in front of you. If those rules do not require the developer to insert those things within their development, it doesn't happen. Now, there are some countries in the Caribbean that do have standards related to implementing green spaces and public spaces. In Trinidad, we have one standard of 10%. That's as far as it goes. It doesn't say that the space should be well designed. It doesn't say that the space should allow a variety of uses. And in many other countries, there aren't even those types of regulations or rules. So that is definitely one entry point in terms of looking at the regulation of the built environment. But I think a much more important and a much better strategy would really be looking at how development actually happens in the Caribbean. It happens by a developer, maybe one individual developer, or one individual household owner, or one landowner who may have children and may subdivide the land, and then they all decide to get together and do something. It's really looking at those avenues. So actually just speaking to those persons, engaging them in conversations, and you have to demonstrate the economic benefits of some of the things that you're asking them to do. Of course, the health benefits and the social benefits are pretty important, but the economic benefits are one of the things that developers look at, and we have to insert that in the conversation.
Great, thank you very much. We have a couple more questions and I want to make sure I get through them all. So Professor Maiku, this one is for you. How can we reconnect the health sector with the planning departments and authorities in Caribbean countries with respect to urban greening, promoting walking paths and biking lanes? Professor Maiku, I believe your mic is muted. If you could unmute your mic, thank you.
Sorry, thank you. It's a good question. I think James alluded to it when he mentioned that there is a tendency to operate in silos. And I think if we can begin to sit at the table as practitioners, policymakers, the academy, researchers working directly with health personnel, if we can sit at the table and begin to have dialogue that this climate change that we are experiencing in our region, it's not going to go away. The trends are showing that there's going to be more heat stress. There is going to be more waterborne and vector-borne diseases as a result of flooding and so on. If we can get buy-in to that and we can work more closely, we can begin to sort of design policies that we can implement to see some change. Now, all the policies will be implemented overnight, but we need to have that dialogue as to what are the priorities and how to get them done in terms of sequencing.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you. Your response, in fact, indeed, all the responses have also sparked a question on my part having to do with engagement with the public. We know that behavior modification when it comes to policy making can be a very long and arduous process. And I'm curious to hear from any of you, perhaps Professor Maiku or Renelle in particular, about how we might engage with the public to ensure that much of this integrated and systematized policy making happens. We know that there are varied perceptions around land use and development among many different groups in the Caribbean. And so I'm thinking about perhaps how might data collection within the public and across the public be done? Might that be useful? Thinking about perhaps public education campaigns to enable this behavior modification that is going to be so important, necessary for this policy making to take place. So that's the question. Strategies for engagement with the public and ideas for how we might ensure kind of sort of a smooth behavior modification process with regards to greening cities.
Renelle, do you want to go first?
Yes, I'll jump in here. Again, this is a very important issue and a very important topic. I think we don't necessarily need to reinvent the wheel. I think the public in general is very clear on the kind of urban environment that they would like to see. I think back to the National Spatial Development Strategy exercise I was involved in a couple of years ago. There were lots of comments coming from the public saying that they want to see greener spaces, they want to see better spaces. But how do we really have the conversation to lead towards implementation? And I think, again, we need to look at existing processes and existing forums. There are many community organizations throughout the Caribbean who are working on these kinds of projects. So it's really highlighting and sharing those studies, and that will spark ideas in other groups and other persons. I have seen some partnerships between government and civil society. There's a project I'm working on now, actually, where a government ministry is working to set up community-led organizations. This is completely housed with persons who are from local areas, and they are the ones who decide what are the things that they want to see in that area. They are planning their own projects, implementing their own projects. And again, it's really just to give people a forum where they should just go ahead and lead the conversation. And at the end of it, they get the support for implementation, whether that may mean funding or whether that may just mean support from a local government body in terms of materials, etc.
Great, thank you, thank you. We have one more question, and I want to make sure that we get them all in before we have to wrap up at around 2:50. So, Professor Maiku, with respect to active transport, what is the potential for providing shaded areas for walking and cycling paths to help walkers and cyclists protect themselves against heat and therefore be more likely to use active transport infrastructure?
Right, so that's a very challenging question. In the Caribbean, as you know, we are experiencing some temperatures that as a child I never experienced. I walked from school on afternoons, and I don't ever remember it ever being so hot. So we are experiencing heat stress, and how are we going to actually calm that heat stress is the real question. You know, in Renelle's presentation, she said that you didn't have to reinvent the wheel, that there are pockets of urban areas where we can actually find spaces and begin to do some greening. And I think that's what we have to do. Look at, begin to map out areas using GIS technology tools and satellite imagery, and identify open spaces where we can begin to have some sort of seed projects going and see how they work. We can't do everything all at once, but we can find some, the word I was looking for was pilot projects, and begin to select plant species. As you know, I done my master's degree in Hong Kong, and I was fascinated with what Singapore had done. in terms of the leafiness of that city, the greening. And there is a lot that we can learn from what they did in Singapore, which is very flat. It doesn't have the land and sea breezes and the topography volcanic islands have, with much more cooling effects in their valleys. It's flat, but they've done a remarkable job. And I think we need to take a page out of their book in terms of selection of plant species. The horticultural division, the forestry division, begin to identify broad canopy trees. How will you plant them, maintain them, tap them, coat them? There's a lot of technology, tools available, and we don't need to have, expensive technology to do these very simple things.
Thank you so much. Thank you. This has really been a very engaging and instructive panel, set of presentations. I want to thank each and every one of you for really sharing and sparking our interest and getting us thinking and taking ideas back insofar as research and implementation of greening cities across the Caribbean is concerned. My heartiest thanks to the planners and the coordinators of this panel, and we look forward to following up with you, perhaps on another panel, in another setting, another forum. Continued best wishes for everything, and we're going to wrap up and end. I believe we are just about on time, so many thanks to you again, and over to the planners and coordinators to take us out. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.